guys. Welcome back to Think Shank. We are back and continuing our Summer Breaks Takes series. Wonderful to be back. And today we are diving into the Minnesota Timberwolves. I feel like the heartthrob of a lot of us going into, or at least after the early rounds of the playoffs, particularly with the ascension of Anthony Edwards. I think I have a few very insightful points I want to call out, and I think really in totality, this is an extremely, extremely exciting team, a great team to root for, and obviously brought most of their guys back, and I think we're going to have a pretty interesting discussion today. So, as always, thank you so much for watching, and feel free to subscribe, and any feedback, comments, reactions, disagreements, please just at me and scream as much as you'd like. All right, in typical style, we're going to, same plan of attack here, we're going to talk about overall synopsis of last regular season, their playoffs, move over to playoff indicators, look at the roster, look at the shooting regions on the floor. I'm going to summarize and synthesize some of the biggest call-outs to me about their playoff run last year to the Western Conference Finals, look at the offense and defensive schematics for the Wolves' overall playoffs, regular season, etc. And then, of course, position and pivot to forecast into 2025. So let's jump right in. Last season, they finished 56-26, winning 56 games in the bloodbath of the Western Conference. Net differential of third in the NBA at plus 7.1 points per possession. Offensive rating was 16th. Defense was first. They pretty much held the number one defense most of the year. Main things I want to call out there, 56 wins again. They had that whole kerfuffle and late burst to the finish line for the one seed in the Western Conference. Everybody knows that their defense was incredible. I'm going to get into this later, but the arrival, air quote, / mostly integration of Rudy Gobert into their overall system, both offense and defensively, was a huge deal there. But Rudy being the tone setter of driving that defensive-minded culture, not to mention a lot of the guys on this roster having not just talent and defensive instincts, but want. And this came very apparent throughout the playoffs with guys like Alexander Walker talking about how much pride he takes on the defensive end and is smirking like a total psycho, locking up Jamal Murray in the half court early on in that Denver series. So we're going to double click into that. The other important thing here is the offensive rating. Notoriously, their hamstring, lot of reliance on Anthony Edwards, really shouldering and spearheading their offense, both in terms of meaningful scoring production, but also their initiation. And that continued right on into the playoffs, where they ultimately go 9-7. They finish with the 7th best net differential, 7th best offensive rating, as well as the 10th best defensive rating. Quite a step back from the regular season. I think a lot of that can be chalked up to the blow-for-blow intense series against Denver, where each team had basically 2 blowouts of their own. And then, of course, feeding into that incredible 7th-game series. I would also say going into the Dallas series, which I'll actually go into right here, definitely took a hit on their defensive potency and overall numbers. So against Dallas in the Western Conference Finals, they lose in 5 games. They finish with a 6.8 deficit in net differential, offensive rating of 113, defense of 119. If you just compare that apples to apples quickly, 119 defensive rating versus 109 in the regular season, and then 112 on average for the playoffs, clearly that was the really big anchor there that kind of skewed their overall defensive metrics. Against Denver, of course, they win in 7 games. Probably the most exciting series I've seen, at least in 2 playoffs now. Really hallmark, storybook, fictional novel type of series. team constructed to really knock out the defending champs and come in steaming hot, taking 2 games, defending champs clapping back to take the next 3, including an absolute eruption and hallmark performance from Nikola Jokic in Game 5, then falling down into a 20-point deficit at the beginning of the third quarter in Game 7, going on that insane 28-9 run to close out the third quarter, and then ultimately closing it out in the reigning champs buildings in the fourth quarter of Game 7. They finished the whole series with only a 3.4 positive point differential for the series. Offensive rating, 113. Defensive rating, 109. Again, pretty similar to their defensive metrics looking at the regular season. And then before then was, of course, Phoenix, where they swept the Suns, the science lab experiment of rich people buying their way to talent and thinking that they're just gonna overwhelm you and still run away and win with no real schematics on either end of the floor, not to mention a point guard. We'll also get to them, but whatever. Plus 14.8 net differential for the series, offensive rating of 126, defensive rating of 111. First of all, if you let the Wolves average 126 points per possession against you, you gotta rethink things. As well as you can just look at the net differential as well. I mean, anytime you have a net differential over around like 10 or so, pretty solid chance this was a pretty resounding gobsmacking by one team over the other. If you have a plus 15 overall point differential, like, you know, I think it said a lot more about their own deficiencies and weaknesses, or really just lack of strengths or investment in schematic innovation and maximization. But alas, overall synthesis, series by series here, I think what jumps off the page is pretty much just cover up Phoenix. I think that is kind of aboriginal. 126 offensive rating for the Wolves just should never happen, unfortunately. Well, last iteration of the Wolves, I should say. Respectfully, I'm a proponent of the Wolves. I really, really love this team, but again, if they're scoring 126 points per possession on you on average for a 4-game series in the playoffs, you really got to rethink things. Denver and Dallas, I think that those are really good examples of basically where the Wolves are at. You look at the point differentials, and then you look at the average offensive and defensive ratings for each one of the series, and then take a look quickly at the net differential here. I think the difference you can tell is the offensive gap between Dallas and Denver. I already covered Denver. Go ahead and check out the video. I'll probably put it up here or something. But Denver's offense was definitely their biggest stalwart and enabler of their own demise. A lot of it, as I've explained, stems from their fatigue and everything else like that. Dallas is very, very well known for having a high potent offense with one of the 3 best players in the entire NBA, and Luka Doncic, paired with a veteran playoff sidekick in Kyrie Irving. Lively rookie, Gafford, Washington, whatever, came in, best defense after the All-Star break. I weirdly think that this really cleanly reveals how much of the Denver series and their own technical demise came down to their insufficient offense, given the fact that you have the same offensive defensive ratings for the same opponents, and ultimately Dallas still walks out of there in 5 games only. Cool. Moving over to playoff indicators now. So point guard, Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. Off the bench, really didn't play a ton. Monte Morris, Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Why is there so much spit in my mouth? Nickeil Alexander-Walker, TJ Warren, Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid. Of those guys, Alexander Walker, Anderson, and Reed, really the only ones getting consistent rotation minutes. Naz Reid, I'll double-click on, but absolutely instrumental. Finishes as their 3rd leading scorer for the entire playoffs. Coming in, replacing Karl-Anthony Towns. Extremely skilled, extremely versatile big man on this roster. I think virtually every single team in the NBA would want a Naz Reid on their team.
Carl got that 5th foul, and Naz Reid came in and set the tone on both ends of the floor. Just talk about how special he's been this series and what he means to this team.
Me and Cat was just talking about it up here. I think the plus-minus stuff is trash because Nas, when Cat got his 5th foul, Nas came in and he played great defense on Jokic. Got a couple offensive rebounds, hit a big shot, got a big dunk, got a couple steals. He played hard, man. So, he's super important to our team, and we tell him all the time, just stay with it, and he stayed with it tonight, and it showed for sure.
I think just for me, it's just anyone who doubted him being the 6th man of the year, the silence would be louder.
He showed it tonight.
Really, really great shining moments, both just scoring the ball, but also the way that he was able to score. Like, had one of the most insane, epic putbacks in that Denver series that effectively iced one of the games. Some late-game explosions later in that series, I believe, where, just walks in and makes 3 out of 4 threes, basically in the second half of one of those, I believe. Kyle Anderson, biggest call out there. One of my thoughts, criticisms of Chris Finch, the head coach of the Wolves, bringing in Anderson a little bit too late in the Dallas series. I think he actually called that out himself as that series got closer and closer to the end there. Incredible backup, kind of feel, playmaker, facilitator, great court awareness. Obviously, the offense is the big drawback there. Is not really looking for his shot that much of the time. Is much more of that Nick Batum kind of connective tissue guy. The fact that he has probably the slowest shot I've ever seen doesn't really help things either. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, of course, coming in. He had a really great start to the playoffs, but then really, really cooled off. One of the things I really was hoping for him, specifically just as a player, was for him to find his shot making later in that Dallas series. I think you saw it mostly beginning inside of the Denver series. He really did not hit that many shots consistently. You unfortunately felt that in his minutes being reduced as the overall playoffs ended up dwindling. Their starters, Conley, Ant, Jaden, Towns, Gobert, they finished with a plus 14.8 differential for that starting unit. That is incredible. I don't have the ranking for the overall playoffs. I have to assume Boston blows them out of the water, but that is really, really impressive, particularly when you look at the opponents that they faced. Phoenix, again, a little bit of an anomaly, but Denver into Dallas is pretty nuts to still come out your starting unit with almost a plus 15 point differential. Offensive rating, 119. Defensive rating, 104. That is really, really good. If your playoff starting units, defensive rating, holding teams to only 104 points on average a game is really impressive, as well as the offensive rating of 119, you'll notice ends up being better than their average for the overall playoffs, 116, and then, of course, the regular season, basically the same thing. Let's take a look at some of the indicators really quickly. Offense, points per possession, already said this, 116. That is 7th out of all playoff teams. Effective field goal percentage, 54. 4th out of all playoff teams. Turnover percentage, 13th out of 20 playoff/play-in teams. Should have said that earlier. Apologies. At 13.2%. Offensive rebounding percentage, 8th at 29%. Free throw rate, 5th at 22 attempts per 100 possessions. Flipping the script, defensive rating, 113, 10th out of playoff teams. Effective field goal percentage, 15th at 55%. Turnover percentage, 4th at 14%. Offensive rebounding percentage, 5th at 23%. And then free throw rate, 17th out of 20 at 23 free throw attempts per 100 possessions. So the biggest things to call out here, in my opinion, is number one on the defensive end, 17th out of 20 teams as far as defensive free throw rates. How many times are you fouling the other team and how many free throw attempts are you giving up? To be 17th out of 20 is really not good for a very physical, tenacious, defensive-minded team. it is going to be a trade-off that you kind of have to deal with, obviously, for a team as well that is not only very defensively minded, but also pretty offensively stunted. Maybe that's the right word, probably is. You don't want to be giving the other team free points at the charity stripe if you can't really score yourself. So, granted, trade-off, be a good defense, but you got to stop fouling. So that would be one. The effective field goal percentage, too, of 55% being 15th. I think that's an instance of some of the noise with the rankings about playing teams and Minnesota making it to the Western Conference Finals. There's just literally more data there, so you deal with a little bit of a sample size issue, as well as what I'll get into, some of their elements of demise come the Dallas series, but obviously in aggregate, that is really not an incredible effective field goal percentage overall. And then the last thing for defense is the turnover percentage. Coming in at 14.1% and finishing 4th of all playoff teams is really, really impressive, and I think it underscores one of their underlying guiding principles of we know our offense in the half court just isn't very potent. We need to be able to capitalize in transition, easy buckets. Not to mention, we have some really, really athletic freaks on our roster that can run faster than you and finish through you. And clearly that was a huge part of their system. And Coach Finch mentioned that throughout the entire series. And then offensively, the only thing I want to underscore here is something I don't hear talked about a ton, is that Minnesota ends 5th out of 20 playoff teams in offensive free throw rate, their own free throw rate, free throws per 100 possessions, very important. And if you've been following along with me and my thoughts, my takes here, I think the ability to generate free throws is in the top 5, probably top 3 most important skill sets to have for a team to meaningfully achieve it come the postseason. Is a testament, in my opinion, to 2 things: the physicality of Karl Anthony Towns and the bigs on the Timberwolves. Rudy Gobert getting mismatches. They finally started using him and capitalizing on that a little bit too late, at least in the Denver series. Obviously, it was going to be different in Dallas. But then 2 is Anthony Edwards. I feel like the dialogue around Anthony Edwards has swung so far in the corner of nonstop praise and propaganda for how incredibly promising, talented he is, how high his ceiling is, all of that, that it's almost under-discussed how incredible this past postseason run was by him. And in this profile episode of the Timberwolves, I just want to give one take on this very succinctly to refresh everybody about what we just witnessed from this kid. 16 total postseason games, Phoenix sweep, Denver 7 games, Dallas 5 games, 41 minutes a game, averaged 27 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, shooting 48% from the floor, exactly 40% from 3, and 82% from the free throw line. Over 7 attempts from 3, over 6.5 attempts from the free throw line. Obviously, an absolute demon defensively when he was locking in on ball, Jamal Murray, whoever, we all saw it. As the primary offensive engine of a team that went to the Western Conference Finals with Mike Conley missing a game, his starting defensive player of the year also missing a game in that Denver series at 22 years old. I just almost want to just leave those numbers up here and just kind of remind us of what we really saw. And like, again, when I say primary offensive engine, we are not talking about very elaborate and innovative schemes of Anthony Edwards running around and flying off screens. We're not talking about great facilitation from Conley and Cat. His usage was enormous, and he is not only responsible clearly for the offensive scoring production, but the initiation as well. And on top of that, the whole locking in defensively, point of attack defender probably, upper 90th percentile in my opinion. I mean, he's a turnover generating machine. You saw Jamal Murray get absolutely swamped by him, et cetera, et cetera. To obviously wipe away Phoenix, they had their own problems. I'll get to it in a later video. To take on the reigning champs, beat them in 7 games, 7th game being on the road, trailing in that third quarter series. Again, in my opinion, says a little bit more about Denver than Minnesota, but sometimes this just happens, and it is what it is. And then, of course, running out of gas in the conference finals against Dallas, who, face it, like, the Thunder were really, really good. As I outlined in my previous videos about Oklahoma City, they kind of shot themselves in the foot with not taking Giddey out of the rotation quick enough and some of those decisions, but is what it is. The propaganda from the NBA and a lot of talking heads about Ant being the best American-born NBA player and trying to crown him as that and constantly lauding him gets pretty old to me too. But it was absolutely unbelievable what, again, this 22-year-old kid was able to do for an offensively stunted team, given the usage, given the pressure, given the opponents, and then given the actual outcomes and efficiencies. I just kind of warped my own brain and refreshing myself for this episode. And yeah, this kid's really good. But yeah, this kid is really, really good, dude. I just think it's just worth just putting that out there. We're going to close the book there. That's all we want to say. Ant is unbelievable, incredible ceiling, incredible attitude, and that is all we're going to say. Pivoting quickly to playoff shooting, looking at offense, efficiency-wise, they were 12th in rim field goal percentage, 10th in mid-range, 8th in three-point. Frequency was 3rd at the rim, 18th from the mid-range, and 12th from 3. So notable concepts there. They were 3rd in frequency in terms of rim field goal attempts, but only 12th in efficiency. Not a really great sign, and unfortunately, my estimation, Rudy kind of earns a lot of the blame for that. In addition as well, I think Lively and Gafford, their interior defense on Dallas' side was exceptional, and it's only going to get better as we go into next season. I was definitely encouraged to see the same trend from the regular season carry over into the postseason as far as the three-point offense. 8th in efficiency, only 12th in frequency. I think everybody understood that Minnesota's game plan was get guys going downhill and generate those kickouts, make the easy passes, as Coach Finch always said in his postgames. They have a lot of good shooters on this team. Like, they really do. Conley, I don't know if it was a career year, but I swear that dude missed maybe 5 threes the entire postseason and shot 40% on over 7 attempts a game across 16 postseason games. Naz Reid, Cat definitely didn't shoot that well, unfortunately, at least not until later in the Dallas series. Jaden really woke up throughout that Denver and Dallas series too, actually was instrumental in that third quarter comeback against Denver. So consistent production from regular season, postseason. They don't chuck threes, but they definitely hit the quality of threes that they generate because they are of such high quality, generally speaking. Defense now, efficiencies, 11th at the rim, 9th in the mid-range, 17th from 3. Frequency, 12th at the rim, 15th from mid, 5th from 3. Really interesting to note here, something that surprised me was their opponents shot the 5th most threes against them, but shot 17th out of 20 playoff teams in efficiency or accuracy. If I were to outline, or I would have predicted which sort of region on the floor that their defense would have had a chink, air quote, in the armor, it would have been from the perimeter. Karl Anthony Towns on the perimeter, obviously that is more of a vulnerability, I guess, off the dribble and actually getting around him, getting him to foul, bite on moves, etc. But that's really, really encouraging, particularly against Dallas and Boston and Oklahoma City. those schemes are very, very methodological and pretty rigid, frankly. It is spin cycle, washer, dryer, drive kicks until you sharpen the knife enough to get a high quality shot and then knock it in. I would say, though, I do think Denver's poor, relatively speaking, outside perimeter shooting in their series against Minnesota probably helped them a lot, particularly when you think about the blowouts that happened. And most of the time when Denver did have their own blowouts or efficiently score, it was a lot of Nikola Jokic in his patented mid-range office or short mid-range, not so much their threes. As I covered in my previous videos about their three-point percentages, go look at it. Denver does not shoot threes. They also did not make a lot of the threes that they did take. Really tough recipe for victory, at least unless you have the best player in the world like a Nikola Jokic. So while probably a little inflated as far as three-point defense is concerned, that is, again, something that interests me when you forecast the Oklahoma Cities, the Bostons, and the Dallases. That's a really good segue now into the first section of analysis where I'm just going to synthesize my biggest takeaways from the past playoff run. Number one is that the Denver victory was clearly the goal. When Minnesota beat the Nuggets, a team that had never been even to the second round of the playoffs in God knows how long, it was since KG in like 2003. I was like 5. That's nuts. I think that milestone, the fact that the team construction strategy, obviously they were built to beat Denver, it actually worked. The poetic nature of Denver slaving for the number 1 seed and effectively burning their reserve tanks of fuel and energy to beat them and even close out a 20-point lead in the third quarter. Everyone knows the story. It really, to me, felt like an overachievement. It really did. Obviously, you look at it on the other side. Denver had that lead. Sure, they went into that 0-2 hole. Sure, Minnesota lacked the playoff experience, but you just look at everything sort of in this box. Everybody had the amount of experience that they had and talent and coaching and schematics and everything. I think if you run that simulation 100 times, I think Denver wins that series about 80 of them, honestly. I think about 8 out of 10 times Denver ends up winning that series. Obviously, our multiverse did not lie in one of those. And the payoff for integrating Rudy, everything Ant said after their first round sweep against Denver in the previous season, buying into their defense first overall mantra and culture, having it kind of pay off in that hallmark way on the road, everything like that. Basically, these are all drivers to me of why I think Minnesota entered into that Dallas series in the conference finals. Absolutely no shot. I think that in a box, overachieving in Denver, it was clearly something they had talked amongst each other about all season long. They had their sights directly aimed at Denver. The way it ended up going with a historic comeback in the third quarter, down 20, fighting tooth and nail, eliminating them on the road, best player in the world, third MVP. I could literally just keep going with all of the insane just elements of this crazy storyline. And obviously good for the Timberwolves for doing it. Like, what are you going to say about that? But yeah, there was no way they were going to beat Dallas. So that is just element number one. Number two is the overall fatigue. And this relates to a compilation that I have on my YouTube channel. I really like to stitch together post-game interviews, particularly in the playoffs, kind of bringing thematic excerpts from coaches and players after the series and everything like that. So go check it out. But the relevant part here was, in classical fashion, Anthony Edwards was extremely transparent about how this Dallas series went off the rails. And he said two main things. One, like I said, they didn't expect to get there. They did not expect it the entire series, and that manifested itself primarily in a physical manner. They were wiped the fuck out by that 7-game dogfight against the reigning champs. And you saw it with Anthony Edwards on the court, where the game plan, again, is essentially Luka Doncic level production with a quarter of the level of playoff experience and just growth. And this kid is essentially piloting this plane with, at that point, it's 90% instinct and raw physical ability, but he's fatigued as absolute fuck and can't even really do what he was able to do in the Denver series. And Ant was basically like, yeah, now we know, and we just need to be way more physically aware. And now that we understand what it actually takes to get this far, right? After 16 playoff games, he was like, yeah, we just literally did not physically prepare and do what it ended up taking to get this far, and we did not have enough left in the gas tank. Those are the two main things right there. They overachieved, and as soon as they beat Denver, that was basically their title. And so psychologically, you're just not going to be able to muster the necessary fight, swagger, juice to come out against another opponent, might I add, drastically different than Denver as far as play styles, schematics, adjustments. I would even say skill level, given where Jamal and Michael Porter Jr. wound up landing as far as performance in that Minnesota series. And then you come into Dallas, where they essentially just beat an Oklahoma City team that played pretty similarly stylistically, aside from the 5-out stuff. But the drive kicks, it's almost like an absolutely exhausted SGA against Dallas's. Again, they're probably going to finish in the top 5 defense in this upcoming regular season, I would imagine, even with Luka and Kyrie inevitably missing games. They're that good. It really came down to building the awareness. This is what it takes mentally, psychologically, physically to get to that point. And then also another clip that I really love is Nickeil Alexander-Walker pointing out the fact that they were still, even at that point, 7 wins away from an NBA title, and they were absolutely and utterly exhausted. So that is why I think those two elements really drove the outcomes there. Next on the list here, Anthony Edwards, proven centerpiece, shows promise, 22 years old, proven focal point, potency, scorer, initiator, defensive presence, on ball, off ball, can get a little heady, spacey, sure. I personally wouldn't bet against him. Again, physical, psychological preparations for a deep playoff run. I feel relatively confident he's going to get a handle on the off-ball defense stuff and be able to up his consistency there, even against playoff pressure and intensity. And then, of course, the elite downhill pressure. Next is the Cat inconsistency. Too little, too late versus Dallas. Points and rebounds overall, very high volatility. If you just swing over here to some of Karl Anthony Towns' production in the postseason, I'll just read off some point totals in some of these games from these past playoffs. 19, 12, 18, 28, 20, 27, 14, 13, 23, 10, 23, 16, 15, 14. Like a 28-point game, 27-point game, but then also literally a 10-point game, a 12-point game, a 14-point game. Those are just points. In my brain, Karl actually showed quite a bit of maturity in the sense of understanding and recognizing when his outside perimeter shooting was not really going and not continuing to hurt the team by continuing to chuck shots. I actually thought, particularly in the Denver series, he really, really diverted his offensive scheme and approach there to getting himself closer to the basket, being a hound on the glass, getting offensive rebounds. Obviously, guarding Nikola Jokic for the entire series has to be awful. But you even look at the total rebounds here. 7, 8, 13, 10, 4, 5, 6, 12, 12, 11, 5. It's all over the place. And that is a little nerve-wracking to me. It is really great to have diversity of play styles and, I guess, a bag in which you can produce offensively as far as, am I offensive rebounding? Do I really like my matchup in the power forward position? Am I able to take guys closer to the rim? Also, I know I can shoot really well. I'm very confident in that. But if it's not working out, I can go back to the other thing because I'm enormous. Am I going to get called on a charge? Probably. But keeping that pressure there in place, not only on your defender, but on the officials, I actually do think there is some latent value there that ends up paying off certain times and sometimes, particularly in that Game 7. But again, overall, too much volatility. You, in my opinion, can't be talking about how you're the best shooting big man of all time and shit like that, and then proceed to put up 10 points, 14 points, 15 points in a playoff series, as well as rebounding like 5 boards, 4 boards, and then other games 12, 13. Again, these are pretty consistent opponents, right? We're talking about playoff series in a relatively consistent trial and case study. I thought particularly in that Dallas series, he really finally did seem to wake up and find his outside shooting, which to me, maybe not the best outside shooter big of all time, but it's really fucking good. And that is an incredible, incredible weapon that the Wolves have at their disposal, but it is very volatile. I would just add the other footnote here. I was extremely impressed with his overall defensive performance on Jokic. By far, not only the best defender on Minnesota, but best that I've seen in the postseason, even thinking back to Denver's title run, where they cakewalked all the way to the finals. If I'm Minnesota, I got to feel pretty good about that because, again, it's awesome to have Anthony Edwards average 27, 7, and 7, but you have a however many time, 4-time All-Star and Karl Anthony Towns and all of that stuff. My last parting thought on that, I have a theory that the Minnesota curse of not getting to the second round of the playoffs since KG in like 2003, I have a theory that that pressure was hardest on Cat. Obviously trying to lead and guide this team to that milestone as the guy didn't happen. And everybody is, you know, in love with this heartthrob in Anthony Edwards and seemingly for pretty good reason. I don't know why. It just kind of felt like that way to me. Like trying to drive, you know, throughout that Denver series, his outside shot was very, very shaky. It really felt like to me that that was probably something in his mentals, and especially when you think about that track record in history, primary defender on the best player on the planet, also on the hook for the second most production offensively. I don't know. It just kind of feels that way to me, that might be something that kind of messed with his mentals and psyche there. Obviously, it's not an excuse. I just don't think I've heard anybody else mention that. So, I don't know.
For Cat to get over this hump, he's been with the franchise so long, and also overcoming the pressure that he probably had on him more than just about anyone in this game.
Yeah, I think it means a lot. I think you see how at peace and happy he is right now. You know, he had to trust that he was never going to be marginalized. You know, it's all young players always think that they can do it all by themselves, but in this league, nobody can. You know, he's been on many teams where he's had to do a lot, and he's got incredible skill to do so. But he's really bought into doing all the other things that we need him to do. You know, last series he guarded Durant. This year is Jokic. You know, score, play through him when the moment is there, but we're not playing through him all the time. Staying ready, staying positive, you know, and staying mentally in it. And you know, couldn't be more happy and proud for him, just because, you know, I think he's faced a lot of unfair criticism when it comes to the postseason at times, because, you know, but the more you go through these things, the more experience you have, and the more more at peace you are,
What does it mean to go back to Target Center? Now you're going to be hosting the Western Conference Finals in front of your fans. Just what this means for the organization in general.
I'm gonna let you talk about that. I only been here 3 years.
Oh, now you only been here 3 years. The fans have been waiting for this moment, and this team has brought them this moment. So, it's up to us now to capitalize on this opportunity and be the best team we could be, and like I said, play Timberwolves basketball. Every time this series we played Timberwolves basketball, we've had the result we've been looking for, and every time we try to deviate from that plan, it hasn't done well. So the fans know what they want.
Today was crazy, but we was down 20.
That wasn't Timberwolves basketball. That was Park basketball. Then we started playing.
That was Wolves basketball.
Then we started playing. That was Wolves. Now we play Timberwolves at the end.
The last thing I want to call out here is the fearless culture. I really love Minnesota's culture. I love the defensive mentality. Dogs have a lot to prove. Again, the playoff drought or second round playoff drought, great.
Yep.
Eddie McDaniels, Western Conference. What's the award that they give out? Oh, they don't give it out yet. My bad. Yeah, but regardless, Jay McDaniels was the MVP of the last two series. Once again, he did it again. Jay McDaniels.
What do you think led to just the response that you guys had tonight?
Shit, we got Mike Conley back. That was it.
What makes you guys believe that you guys don't have to wait any longer, that just getting past the second round isn't the goal, that you guys can win the next 2 rounds?
I think, and I think this is the biggest thing to answer that question. It starts with our head coach, Chris Finch. He comes in every day, comes to work, he gets there early. He's thinking of ways to get me and Kat open looks. He's thinking of ways to get Mike and Rudy open looks. He's thinking of ways to get Jaden involved. He's trying to keep Nas in it to get him involved. He's just a great coach, and he don't sugarcoat anything with anybody. Like, if Kat fucking up, he gonna get on Kat. If I'm fucking up, he gonna get on me. If Rudy fucking up, he gonna get on anybody that's messing up throughout the game. And I think that's what makes him the best coach in the NBA to me. The main thing today was his ass stayed out of foul trouble like I told him in the Phoenix series. That was all that was. Yeah, I mean, I cussed him out. Every chance I get, bro, stop fucking fouling. Like, I think you guys see it. Like, if Kat don't foul, we pretty much can win the game every time. And tonight, I mean, he had 3 fouls, but he only had 3. He didn't have 5. So I told him today, like, we thankful that you didn't foul, because if you foul, we lose, because you the best matchup we got for Jokic. Like, you do the best job on him. You know what I mean? We coming to double, but you do the best job standing up to his first dribble. And he did that tonight, man. He only took 10 shots. We counted on him making the right play. This morning, we was all on him, like, bro, you got to make the right play. We're going to play off of you in the post tonight. Like, they have no matchup. And he did an outstanding job of just making that easy pass. And when they don't double, he was aggressive. And, man, Kat played great tonight on both sides of the ball. Bro, Jaden played great tonight. He took 10 shots and had 21. Yeah, he was fantastic tonight. Yeah, for sure. Big shout out to him. He's the X factor of the team. I think everybody knows it. When he plays well, we win. I don't know the percentages, but I mean, I feel like when Jaden plays well, can't nobody beat us. So.
But the defense first mindset, embracing Rudy, and this is probably a good time to call out one of my favorite excerpts of all post-game interviews from last playoffs, where Chris Finch, head coach, flags something that I feel like 99.9% of people miss, especially when they clown Rudy Gobert and they laugh at him for getting roasted by Jokic, and he's a goofy guy and he looks really silly. Great. But he essentially said, in response to a question about Rudy and the defensive culture and how the team has rode its defense first scheme and mindset and approach to winning basketball games, and he just very casually mentioned, like, yeah, Rudy showed up here and absolutely drove that culture, and it's been, like, the most important thing that he's done for this entire team. And so he said this in context of how did Minnesota become such a defense, such a prominently defense-first team, and having so many guys that not only, again, show the skill sets and physical tools to be very effective defenders, but all of that want and that passion and drive to like take ownership of that side of the ball. And Coach Finch was like, yeah, Rudy drove that. Like Rudy basically drove that defensive culture, and it was something that we absolutely needed. And sorry, I won't talk about that in circles, but I think that tone setting and buy-in and on-court leadership from a guy like Rudy is something I never hear anybody ever mention, ever, as far as Rudy's impact in raising the floor of this team. It's just a lot of clowning for the way he looks when he has the ball and his misses and getting roasted by the best player in the world and yada, yada. But some of those secondary impacts in driving and setting the tone for that defensive culture that clearly not only almost got them the 1 seed in the bloodbath of a Western Conference, but to beat the reigning champs and get to the conference finals, I don't know how you can put a quantitative indicator on that. Obviously, you can't. But it's got to be really big. And the more I thought about it, the more kind of underrated I feel like that is in the public consciousness of Rudy's value. It really struck me as an angle and a secondary impact that I really hadn't considered before. And especially with guys like Ant, right? Where really kind of flashy, obviously very confident. But then I almost think about LaMelo Ball, Zion Williamson, really, really talented guys that show a lot of promise. The health thing aside, the defense is obviously a huge question mark for those guys, right? Ant has absolutely silenced a lot of doubters with his on-ball defensive potency. Off-ball can still get a little bit spacey, but clearly in the playoffs, I genuinely think, one, he was better than most people point to, but will be very much more consistent. But I can't help but think about the Zion Williamsons, the LaMelo Balls, just really high upside offensive players, and lacking some of that direction setting and mentor and guidepost for the importance and value of defensive impact and cultivating a meaningful culture of prideful defensive effort is really, really cool. And I just want to give Rudy props for that. So let's talk about the offense and defenses very quickly now. So number one, offense. Perimeter requirements. The Minnesota Timberwolves absolutely necessitate its outside perimeter shooters to knock down shots to unlock spacing for its insanely high gravity, high pressure star in Anthony Edwards to get downhill into space where he's proven potent both from his pull-up jumper as well as at the rim, as well as drawing fouls, doing either, primarily the rim. And of course, that extends to Karl Anthony Towns as well. So guys like Jaden McDaniels, Naz Reid, Alexander Walker, insert whoever, everyone besides Rudy Gobert essentially has to be established as capable of making shots, very similar to Dallas, and why, right, they really suffered to Boston. It's very, very difficult for Anthony Edwards, even with all his physical gifts, to really capitalize on his downhill pressure when guys can sag off and dare him to pass the ball up to Jaden McDaniels, etc. So I think that inherently, based on what we saw, is going to put a realistic hard cap on, I think, their offensive ceiling as is. Although, again, the potency of Karl Anthony Towns as well as Anthony Edwards, their continued elevation of their games, maybe we can see some even more improvement off that. Anthony being able to take guys off the dribble even more, hitting even tougher shots, maybe getting him off of screens and rising and firing. The next point here is that the facilitation skills are kind of lacking. Cat, Conley, the secondary facilitators, playmakers in their starting and closing lineups, Conley, of course, is a very seasoned point guard. He is a great kind of assist to turnover ratio guy, Tyus Jones, whatever. Makes the right read every single time. Funny enough, I think Jokic said he was like one of his favorite players ever because he always makes the right play and pass. I felt, especially in that Dallas series, that their ability to really unload some of that initiation pressure off of Ant when he was essentially getting double teamed and teams really not allowing him to drive the offense, being able to very effectively and almost instinctually capitalize on the extra attention that Ant will attract is very important. And I think Conley's really important because he had a career shooting year. He was absolutely lights out from shooting. So he is very, very important for Minnesota spacing, being the next guy over from Ant, being the release valve from double teams, allowing him to then make that second read based on the coverages, who was coming off to double Ant, etc., was just really, really important. And I think we all really felt that in Game 5 when Conley had to miss a game. I think he was hurt or something, and they were double-teaming Ant to absolute death, as well as Karl-Anthony Towns. And the two of them being the release valve for each other was, like, really, really not effective. They clearly were not used to that. And even Ant, after the following game in Game 6, where they clapped back and pushed it to Game 7, said, when asked what was the biggest difference for tonight after getting blown out in Game 5.
What do you think led to just the response that you guys had tonight?
Shit, we got Mike Conley back. That was it.
That's why they need his release valve and secondary playmaking for any of their offense to work. Otherwise, you're going to choke off Anthony Edwards from anyone else, and nobody else can initiate or put the ball on the floor. In addition, the Jaden growth, I think, is really notable as well. Particularly, again, in that third quarter, unbelievably historical comeback and bounce back, 20 points down, coming back. I think Jaden hit like 2 very, very clutch threes. But even into the Dallas series, the guy was really weirdly consistent. I'm sorry, I don't want to say weirdly. That doesn't sound very nice. Game 1 against Dallas, he went 6 for 9 from 3. Obviously, Dallas was going to dare him to make open shots. Later on, he goes 3 for 4, 2 for 4, 2 for 4. And the important thing with him, I'm starting to realize, is, well, twofold. One, the putting the ball on the floor, attacking closeouts, cultivating some of that secondary playmaking, not just skill, but instincts. When should I shoot? When can I drive? That kind of thing. Even some of his free throw attempts really juiced up in certain games when you saw he was kind of like catching on to what the defensive scheme was, again, making the read, attacking, shooting, etc. But then also the timeliness of some of these shots. I know I mentioned the third quarter shots. He had like 2 absolutely must-haves in order to surmount this deficit in Game 7 against Denver. But he doesn't actually feel very affected by the moment, and was maybe the only player offensively for the Wolves in that Dallas series that actually felt pretty reliable. Maybe Cat super late in the series when it was too little too late. But Jaden doesn't seem very fazed by high-pressure shots, and I just thought that was really notable.
For them, McDaniels tonight is by far our best game of the series. He played great. 21 points, 4 rebounds, 2 blocks. Ant's going to give you what Ant's going to give you, and their bench scored 23, our bench scored 2.
The other really interesting insight I got offensively for the Wolves this past playoff run was about the same number of possessions they played with Ant at the 1, Alexander Walker at the 2, McDaniels at the 3, Naz Reid at the 4, and then Cat versus Rudy at the 5. Shockingly, there was a 20 points per possession drop-off with Cat at the 5 instead of Rudy. I was going to bring this up as a potential wrinkle or something to add in the toolbox when going up against or forecasting the 2025 playoffs against a team like Dallas, which Oklahoma City used its infrastructure of 5-out system that it only ever played with against Dallas to very real, meaningful success in that series. But it doesn't seem like the offensive potency was there. Granted, it's with Alexander Walker, Naz Reid, but in my opinion, this is a time of diversifying and upping your versatility for these myriad of different matchups and all the geometry and trying to excavate any advantage you can possibly get. When you have guys like Derek Lively, Daniel Gafford, Anthony Davis, Yusuf Nurkic, or God forbid Mitchell Robinson or something, right, in the finals. Like, you know what I'm saying? If you have very traditional bigs, you want to space them out. Not to mention you have maybe the biggest downhill threat pressure guy in the entire NBA. It's like him and Ja Morant and Zion, right? More space, more help. Instead of relying on your outside perimeter guys to establish that they can make threes, Jaden McDaniels, even Karl Anthony Towns, to then unlock more spacing in drives to the basket, much like Dallas in the finals, right? When Derrick Jones Jr. just couldn't make any shots, and neither could PJ Washington. Luka was screwed. Kyrie was screwed. And so forcing the space open by literally having a 5-out system with a spaced big in Karl Anthony Towns, I really think should be something they should think about and toy around with. I'm not just trying to clown Rudy because he couldn't stay on the court with Victor Wembanyama in the Olympics and yada yada. But again, in the overall theme of diversifying offensive schemes against different matchups, parking Rudy in the dunker spot honestly might not be the most offensively potent approach with very good rim protectors like a Chet Holmgren, like an Anthony Davis, like a Nurkic, like a Zach Edey. God damn. Just something I found kind of interesting. Now, defensively, don't have to spend too much time here. It's pretty implied. Versatility and talent, I've covered this in previous videos, but Jaden at point of attack, as well as Anthony Edwards, Rudy and Cat at the rim, and Jaden Alexander Walker perimeter. Very succinct way to put it is you have a lot of guys with great physical tools to be good on defense. Length, reach of the boogeyman of Jaden McDaniels. That is the last dude I would ever want chasing me around the court. That is a note from Jamal Murray. Don't try it. Rudy Gobert, Karl Anthony Towns, length, whatever. Also, on top of that, defensive instincts. These are just guys that clearly had to claw their way into meaningful minutes on a basketball court. I'm looking at you, Jaden Alexander Walker, even Mike Conley, being so undersized. These are all guys with great instincts and physical tools. And then on top of that, you have the defensive culture spearheaded by none other than Rudy Gobert. Chris Finch has called this out. It's a very, very important part of their identity and culture as a team, taking pride on the defensive end. The Cat foul issue still lingering. I would say overall improvement, though early foul trouble still has a very big impact. I think we're all aware of that. There were a couple of games, I think in the Denver series, obviously he's guarding the best player in the world. It's not going to be easy, but really tall orders. Karl Anthony Towns, everybody knows, kind of funky, really floppy footwork, especially in space. I thought, relatively speaking, did a pretty solid job trying to sort of limit himself while also taking on some of the hardest defensive assignments. Again, Nikola Jokic, Aaron Gordon, PJ Washington, even Kevin Durant, goddamn, like, not going to be the easiest thing ever. But the bigger point I want to point to is him getting in early foul trouble. Naz Reid gets more minutes. I'm going to talk about this later, but Naz, even looking from an on-off point differential perspective, really did not do that well. Even being the third leading scorer on this team, his defense was a real weakness. And their lineups did not perform very well in that Denver and Dallas series, even though he did have absolutely essential outburst offensively. Karl Anthony Towns getting in foul trouble earlier, it's just going to throw off all the cycles and the rotations of things. So thought he did a better job. I still think there's more improvement he can make. Overall, really effective, especially in that Denver series. So now looking ahead to 2025. Projected wins, 52.5. I have their seed ranging from 2 to 3. Floor, second round of the playoffs. Ceiling is title. I think this is pretty intuitive. The regular season for Minnesota, they're just going to be buoyed by their defense. They are just so tenacious, bought in, and prideful when it comes to the defense, which is really the main thing everybody points to in terms of the nuance looking at regular season versus playoffs. Suddenly, defenses get better, offenses get more timid and shaky. A team like this, though, that doesn't really need to wake up or lock in during the regular season is ultimately just going to have a higher floor when it comes to winning regular season games. Guys will miss time. Lineups are trying to be ironed out. Schematics are getting solidified. Karl Anthony Towns' consistency, mostly looking here at the playoffs. I think that's going to be really, really important. Ant has more than proven himself to be a viable number one option on a very deep playoff team. His inconsistency on the offensive end particularly is going to be maybe the most significant variable in determining their ultimate playoff achievement. I say this also because of the stretch four power forwards being the most coveted role in the NBA right now. Him specifically somehow managing to be very effective, air quote, against Jokic, even though he's still averaging a triple-double and like over 26 points a game. But you need him for the defensive end. You need him to not get in foul trouble. But most importantly, by far, especially since you do have Naz Reid on the bench, Cat needs to produce more consistently. And again, that's not even just points. Looking at his volatility of rebounding as well, obviously matchups and other things can somewhat influence that, but when you have playoff games where you only get 4 rebounds and you're 6'10", I don't know, in a double big lineup, okay, but that is just an enormous component of this team for Minnesota, is Karl Anthony Towns establishing himself from the outside to then take guys off the dribble, attack closeouts, really upping and honing that playmaking instinct and skill once he is going downhill is going to be really important. Naz's defensive growth. So similar vein to Karl Anthony Towns not getting in early foul trouble, Naz Reid needs to get a lot better on defense. Even being the Wolves' 3rd leading scorer in the postseason, his on-off in virtually all of his lineups are pretty bad. Minnesota needs his offense, which if you've seen any Instagram videos of Naz Reid playing ball, it's kind of insane how skilled this guy is at 6'10". But his defense is really, really the issue. I mean, lateral movement, you see the guy move, it's really not that fluid, especially against strength. He kind of feels and looks like a wing that just got a little few extra inches, both length and height. Wow, that was maybe not the right way to do that. But he's not very strong. He's definitely tall and long, but his movement patterns are weirdly not as fluid as you might think. His shoulders and lateral quickness is not very good. But I really think that that's going to be important for buoying the second units when you think about the Alexander Walkers, and especially if Rob Dillingham ends up getting meaningful minutes for them. I'm sure they're going to give him some runway, especially considering the flashes of offensive potency that Dillingham seems to possess. We'll see what he's like out of the gate. But that feeds into my next point, bench buoying, Alexander Walker, Joe Ingles, Dillingham having to sustain the non-Anthony Edwards minutes. This is very intuitive. Ingles, not very lateral. Guess he is a floor spacer, but secondary playmaking, okay. This really plays into the Naz Reid thing for me, especially when Karl Anthony Towns inevitably gets in foul trouble. He's going to need to be better on the defensive end. It's really that simple. I don't know if he needs to put on more weight, work on his lateral quickness, etc. His on-offs just aren't going to cut it, and now you're bringing in an undersized guard in Dillingham and Joe Ingles, who's 60 years old. So last but not least, the Karl Anthony Towns at the 5 might need more reps, mostly because of diversifying the looks that you can give this insanely diverse and effective landscape in the Western Conference. A bunch of different schemes, a bunch of different skill sets. Denver plays one way, then you go to Dallas and they play completely opposite. If Cat being at the 5 has any sort of viability to it, I think specifically that would be helpful against your traditional big lineups, right? We saw what Oklahoma City was able to do against Gafford and Lively as far as stretching them out. Anthony Davis comes to mind, Yusuf Nurkic, even though he's not really even that good at the 5. Chet Holmgren, absolutely, is a really, really big one. So I'm just thinking about ways that they can diversify the stuff. Obviously, Chris Finch has really employed that Michael Malone, Tom Thibodeau, Steve Kerr kind of, these are our starters, these are our closers kind of mentality here, and obviously that's okay. These are our guys. We're going to ride them out. What are you going to say about it? It still just might not be good enough. And I don't want to just frame this all around Rudy getting played off the floor, defending in space, and clowning the guy. But I think there's a way to present the idea of innovating and expanding viable looks and schemes in the context of different matchups that isn't even necessarily derogatory towards Rudy. It's just about maximizing what you can do. And if you can stretch defenses apart with one of the most frightening downhill players in the NBA in Anthony Edwards, we don't really understand what Rob Dillingham is about. I know he's a great off-the-bounce shooter. I'm assuming he can probably get his way pretty close to the rim. I don't know. I'm not an expert in the draft, so I'm not going to pretend that way. But unlocking that kind of space might be really helpful. Even if you're going against a 5-out offense, Karl-Anthony Towns versus Chet Holmgren, that's probably okay, right? Because you're basically trading 5-out offenses back and forth, right? I mean, if Chet's, pump fake, attacking closeouts and getting to the cup, he's 7'1". Like, what are you going to do anyway? So giving teams like Oklahoma City and Boston a taste of their own medicine, these are just things that I just think should be on the radars of Finch and his coaching staff as far as, hey, maybe we should get some reps to diversify the looks that we can offer. Maybe instead of relying on Jaden McDaniels, Conley, and Cat to establish their perimeter potency, to then force the other team to open up more driving lanes to get to the hole or rise from the mid-range, what if we force them from the jump with a 5-out spread-out system with Cat at the 5 and park him in the corner or even run off-ball screens for him? He's more than capable of shooting himself, setting screens, whatever you want, to, again, maximize particularly the offensive potency of these Wolves. And last but not least, I just want to call out, I think Terrence Shannon Jr. is really fucking sick. I saw him play a few of his summer league games, and the guy looks really, really, really nice. Obviously, I don't expect him to get meaningful sunlight on the court, but he was just really fearless in a way that corresponds with the Wolves just in my psyche. So that's awesome. And replacing Kyle Anderson with Joe Ingles, I think, is about as good as you can get, possibly, outside of the defensive trade-offs, of course. Ingles, to me, is very similar to the Bogdanovich, right, over in New York or Detroit or back in Utah, whatever, where really helpful secondary playmaker, can shoot from the outside a little bit, facilitate a little bit, but defensively, it's going to be an issue. I don't really see him kind of having that many meaningful minutes, at least come playoff time. But similar to Kyle Anderson as well as Shannon Jr. and probably Dillingham, these are just really fearless guys that are pretty gutsy and confident and bold in how they play, and they all just make sense to me. We'll see what Dillingham ends up doing. I'm sure he's going to get some runway to prove himself, particularly in such a fortified defensive apparatus. I would hope a similar fate falls on Shannon Jr., just because I really, really liked his game in Summer League, again with the fearlessness. And then Joe Ingles, just motherfucking guys with an Australian accent and not being able to move, but just kind of being wet from three, particularly if he has somewhat consistent primary playmaking. We'll see again if Dillingham can provide that. Alexander Walker, whatever it ends up being. There's just something about these big three additions to me that make sense, and I kind of like the upside. So there you go. Really love this team. Proved a lot for sure. And even if some of us feel like the Denver series was a fluke, I think now we are all going to be gifted probably another rematch of it with Denver itself in a similar boat to Minnesota, very much understanding the physical and psychological requirements for very deep playoff runs in a very talented, complex, and diverse Western Conference. So thank you guys so much again, and until next time.